Jasmine walked into the courtroom as a strong and powerful woman, but immediately Judge Miles, a racist, contemptuous judge, publicly humiliated and degraded her simply because of her skin color. But don't think for a second he could continue to belittle her. In just 1 minute, Jasmine had him swallowing his own shame as she slapped handcuffs on that corrupt bastard right in the middle of the courtroom, leaving the entire legal system silent and stunned. The door to the Louisiana courthouse creaked loudly as Jasmine stepped inside. The dim light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the hallway, creating an eerie and fading glow that mirrored the memories she had carried with her for years. The smell of aged paper and the dry, cold air within the building made the atmosphere feel still, as though the space was waiting for something to change. Jasmine could feel each step she took on the cold stone floor beneath her feet. Every footfall echoed, not just in the hallway but deep within her mind, as if each step was a declaration of war against the system that had once rejected her. The portraits of the great judges hung solemnly on the walls, their gazes stern and cold like silent figures refusing to acknowledge her presence. These paintings, though grand and majestic, were nothing more than hollow monuments to a past that failed to see the person standing before them. They could not see her. The feeling inside her was different now. When she had first walked into this building as a young student, she had done so with dreams, hope, and faith in justice. But the cold stares, the mocking glances from those who worked here, had silenced her. They had rejected her not because of her abilities or knowledge, but because of her natural curly hair and the suit they deemed inappropriate. They judged her based on her appearance without a second thought for her talent or passion. She could still recall the day she was asked to leave the courtroom, not for lacking knowledge or capability, but because her skin and her appearance weren't suitable. But today, everything was different. Jasmine was no longer the young, naive student with thick curly hair and a suit that tried too hard to convey seriousness. Now, she stood before the doors of this courthouse as a woman, strong, powerful, and resolute. Her curly black hair hadn't changed, but now she knew it was her strength, not a weakness to be drowned in stereotypes. She took a deep breath, and all the pain of the past, all the rejections from this very system, seemed to tear open before her eyes. Today, she was no longer the one who was rejected, no longer the one who had to bow her head in disdain. Today, she stood on the very foundation of justice, a person with the power to change everything decisively and powerfully. She paused before the security desk, where the guard looked at her as though she were a stranger. He didn't recognize her right away, only eyeing her ID with suspicion. "Are you a relative of the defendant?" he asked, his tone emotionless and indifferent, as if offering no respect whatsoever. Jasmine didn't rush to answer. Instead, standing there, she locked eyes with the guard. The tension, the space, seemed to close in on her, almost pushing her back to the moment when those past wounds resurfaced. But no, she wouldn't be subdued. No one could make her weak like before. With absolute confidence, Jasmine slowly pulled out her federal ID from her purse and gently placed it on the desk before him. "I am Jasmine Crockett, and I am a federal legal advisor." She didn't say anything more, holding her gaze steady and unwavering. The words landed softly, but with a force so powerful that the guard couldn't help but look at her with hesitation. The guard checked the information on the screen, then, after a long silence, stepped aside without a word, allowing her to pass. No apology, no greeting. But Jasmine didn't need any of it. She knew that respect didn't come from words. It came from what she had achieved. Respect came from power and from within herself, and now she had it all. As she entered the courtroom lobby, the sharp pang of past hurts surged again, but this time Jasmine didn't feel afraid. She walked boldly, her eyes fixed ahead, where the old faces still stood, seeing her as an outsider. But now she wasn't just some nameless girl anymore. She was the one who could change this system. The door to the courtroom swung open, and Jasmine stepped inside with a commanding presence. But as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, an all too familiar feeling surged within her. Cold, disrespectful stares from court staff, lawyers, and even the judge made her feel like an outsider, an unwanted presence cast aside. The coldness in their eyes wasn't just indifference. It was deep, cutting contempt, as though they were looking at an invisible object unworthy of their attention. Judge Miles, The same judge Jasmine had encountered when she was a naive student looked down on her with an expression of impatience. His voice came out cold and condescending, as if addressing someone insignificant. But it didn't end there. The court staff around her began exchanging glances full of disdain. Some whispered among themselves, unable to hide their mocking. A few even turned to eye her up and down, their judgments so obvious it felt suffocating. Those looks didn't just evaluate her appearance. They were dismissive, contemptuous, fueled by the presence of a black woman in a space they considered a privilege for the powerful. One female court staff member even snickered, her gaze piercing through Jasmine, refusing to meet her unwavering, resolute eyes. The room seemed to freeze in a tense silence, thick with injustice and scorn. Jasmine felt a surge of anger, a quiet, simmering fury built inside her, but she refused to let it show. She wasn't someone easily beaten down by looks or words. She had grown too familiar with racism, too used to facing people who refused to see her for her talent and intellect, choosing instead to judge her by her skin color and appearance. But today, she was prepared. She wasn't here to passively face this discrimination. She was no longer the young, naive girl who had once been kicked out of a courtroom for her appearance. She had grown, proven herself not just by words but by actions, by the strength and resilience that no one could deny. Each time Judge Miles looked at her with that contemptuous gaze, each time she felt the mockery from the court staff, the anger inside her flared. But instead of letting herself be subdued, she held those feelings tightly, using them as fuel, as a reminder that this was the moment she had to fight. She had to fight not just for herself, but for all those who had been oppressed, pushed to the margins of society simply because of their skin color, because of the way they viewed the world. She was not a loser, and these people would soon realize that they couldn't just brush past her so easily now. Jasmine stood before them not to apologize or accept their scorn. She was here to prove one thing. Justice is not something that can be smothered by the powerful, and one day it would overthrow all those who had tried to hide the truth. Jasmine took a deep breath, and her gaze locked firmly onto Judge Miles, unwavering. She didn't need to say a word. With a determination in her eyes, she knew she was laying the first stones for an inevitable victory. Jasmine stood there, eyes locked with Judge Miles, but in that moment, everything around her seemed to blur, and only the old memories flooded back. The room became eerily quiet, with only the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her chest. She was no longer the hopeful, naive young girl she once was. She was now a strong, mature woman, but the wounds of her past had never fully healed. Jasmine's mind drifted back to the first day she had walked into this courthouse, full of passion and dreams. Back then, she was a fresh graduate with a heart full of zeal and a deep desire to be a part of the justice system she had admired for so many years. The courthouse door had opened just like it did today, but instead of welcoming her, it had closed her out. As she entered, the eyes of those present weren't welcoming. They were filled with contempt. She could feel each gaze burn through her, appraising her from head to toe. The mocking looks felt as if she didn't belong here, as if she had no right to exist in a space they deemed reserved for the race of power. "Can you step outside?" one of the court staff said, her tone void of respect, as if Jasmine wasn't even part of this place. "Your position is not appropriate here." Those words struck deep, like a knife to the heart. She wasn't judged on her abilities, but on her appearance. Years of hard work went unnoticed, all of it dismissed because of her natural curly hair and her black skin. Everything she had done meant nothing to them. Back then, Jasmine had no choice but to bow her head and leave in shame. She could still remember every step as she walked out of that courthouse, her heart heavy, shattered. She wondered if there would ever come a day when she could return here, stand tall, and never let anyone make her feel that way again. But today, Jasmine was back. She was no longer that naive student. Her natural curls were no longer a weakness, but a symbol of strength. Even though she could feel the eyes upon her, the same eyes that had judged her all those years ago, she no longer bowed her head in the face of discrimination. The memory she could never forget, the image of that day, would live forever in her mind. But now she stood here to prove it to herself and to everyone who had been oppressed by the system. This discrimination would never be repeated. Though Jasmine knew the disdainful eyes would still be there, she would not let herself be subdued again. The years of struggle, the wounds that seemed unhealable, had created a woman who stood firm, unafraid, and unwilling to let anyone take away her belief in herself. Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the strength in every beat of her heart. She remembered the words her mother had once said to her. They will never see your true worth until you prove it to them. She took a deep breath, opened her eyes, and stepped forward. She would not let this discrimination repeat itself, and she would make everyone see her with new eyes, the eyes of respect. The air in the courtroom grew thick with tension as Jasmine stepped up to the witness stand. Every step she took seemed to resonate loudly, each echo bouncing off the cold stone floor, a sound that carried weight, a silent declaration of her resolve. But despite the commanding presence she carried, the silence in the room did not last for long. Judge Miles, draped in his solemn black robe, with an expression colder than ice, looked at Jasmine with disdain. His eyes scanned her with a deep, palpable contempt, as though she were not a person of worth, but just another obstacle for him to discard easily. Jasmine held his gaze, and in that brief moment, she could see the layers of his judgment, the way he belittled her not just because of her race, but because he didn't believe she was worthy of being in this space at all. "Backup witness," Judge Miles said, his voice laced with condescension. "I suppose you're the last on the list. You may sit down if you have nothing important to add." His words pierced the air like daggers. The casual dismissal of her presence, the tone of his voice, as though she were an inconvenience, made her feel small, reduced to nothing more than a placeholder, someone who was only there to fill in when the real witnesses were unavailable. His words echoed around the room, intentionally stripping her of any dignity, as if to remind her that her voice did not matter, that she was not meant to occupy the space. Backup witness. The phrase stung. It was a deliberate attempt to strip her of her identity, to erase her value as a witness. Jasmine was not someone here to speak truth, to uncover injustice, but rather someone who, in his eyes, had no right to be here, someone relegated to the sidelines of this grand stage of justice. The courtroom around her fell silent, save for the sound of the judge's dismissive voice. Jasmine could feel the weight of every eye in the room bearing down on her. The looks from the court staff, the lawyers, even the defendants and the onlookers, all of them scrutinizing her, some with blatant judgment, others with subtle disdain. It was a look that Jasmine had become all too familiar with over the years, the look that judged her solely for her appearance, her skin, her hair, the look that ignored the person beneath all of that. The eyes of the room flicked over her, some of them dismissing her as they would an object they couldn't care less about. A few even shared looks with one another, their lips curling into knowing, condescending smirks. It was as if her very presence here was a mistake, a disruption to the supposed order of the courtroom. Jasmine could feel the mocking glances, silent whispers conveyed in the way they looked at her, like she didn't belong. One staff member even dared to let out a quiet, snide laugh, as if she was sharing some inside joke with the rest of the room at Jasmine's expense. It wasn't just the words spoken by Judge Miles that cut through her. It was the way the room seemed to collectively decide that she wasn't worth their time, that she had no place in this sacred space. In that moment, Jasmine's chest tightened with a familiar fury, her heart thudding in her ears as each word from Judge Miles felt like a direct blow. His words, though spoken casually, were deliberate in their intent to humiliate her. The looks of disdain from the others only magnified the sting. It was a feeling Jasmine had endured many times before, the weight of being overlooked, dismissed, and judged based solely on her race and appearance. The sting of those moments never truly went away, but today it felt sharper, more painful. Yet, Jasmine refused to let that pain show. She kept her face blank, her body still, her posture unwavering in the face of this humiliation. She stood tall. No one in the room would see the tears that threatened to rise, the anger that threatened to break free. She was not going to allow them the satisfaction of seeing her crack. This was not the same Jasmine who had once cowed under such scrutiny. She had fought long and hard to become the woman standing here today, and nothing, not the judge's cruel words nor the contempt of those around her, could break her now. Though inside her a fire raged, fueled by every insult, every glance, and every word that sought to diminish her, Jasmine wasn't here for their approval. She wasn't here to conform to their expectations of what she should be. She was here to demand justice, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been treated as less than because of who they were, for every person who had been reduced to a backup witness in the eyes of a broken system. Her body trembled slightly as the anger built up inside her, but she kept it contained, using that fury as fuel. This was no longer just about her. It was about dismantling everything that had been used to keep people like her down. She was a force, one that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Jasmine knew that today wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about challenging every single person in that courtroom to see her for what she truly was, a force of nature, an unstoppable force determined to right the wrongs. She didn't need to raise her voice or shout. Her very presence, her unyielding stance, was enough to send a message. With each moment that passed, Jasmine's resolve solidified. She didn't need to speak to prove her worth. Her actions, her journey, and the power she carried within her spoke louder than any words could. Judge Miles would soon learn that his attempts to diminish her would have no effect. He had underestimated her, and by the time this was over, he would realize that the true power in this room was not in the hands of those who sought to suppress her, but in the hands of someone who would never bow to injustice again. Jasmine stood there, staring at Judge Miles with an unwavering resolve. Although her lips didn't move, inside her a fierce battle raged. This wasn't just another trial. This wasn't merely her taking the stand to assist in a case. This was war, a battle not just against one individual, but against an entire judicial system that had long looked down upon her and those like her. At this moment, Jasmine was no longer the young girl who had been rejected for her natural curly hair and the color of her skin. She had overcome the pain of the past to stand before the greatest challenge of her life, fighting against a corrupt and unjust legal system. Judge Miles, the people who supported him, and the entire system were protecting an entrenched power structure that had lasted far too long, and now it was time for it to be torn down. She knew that she couldn't just stand by as an outsider anymore. This wasn't the first time Jasmine had faced racial discrimination, but today was different. Today was a real battle. She was no longer afraid of the power wielded by the dominant forces around her. Jasmine had the confidence, the knowledge, and the authority to stand up to them. She took a deep breath, feeling the power rise within her. The legal knowledge, the skills she had spent years perfecting, were now ready to be put into action to crush this injustice. This was no longer the time to sit back and let those who lurked in the shadows manipulate the truth. This was the moment for her to act, to show the court and everyone present that Jasmine Crockett was not someone to be ignored, not someone weak, and definitely not someone who would allow anyone to bring her down. Her eyes swept across the witnesses, the lawyers, the people in the courtroom, and then to Judge Miles. The looks of suspicion still lingered on her, but instead of feeling isolated, Jasmine felt that this was her moment to assert herself. She would not accept a system that was trying to suffocate the truth. She knew that to change everything, she had to throw herself fully into this fight with everything she had. Power didn't only come from position, it came from knowing how to wield it correctly. She wasn't just a witness. She was a warrior, and this was where she would fight, not just for justice for herself, but for everyone who had been forgotten by the system. If I stand still, do nothing, I will never change anything. But if I step forward and act, I can change everything, Jasmine whispered to herself in her mind. She would not allow herself to be pushed back any longer. Now was the time for her to use everything she had, her legal knowledge and her unyielding determination to fight and reclaim the justice that had been denied for so long. The room seemed to shift as she stood tall, ready for whatever came next. This was her battlefield, and she would fight with everything she had. Jasmine was not one to rush into action without thorough preparation. She understood that this battle was not a one-time fight, but rather a long journey that required patience, meticulous planning, and a clear strategy. Although her anger and determination were rising within her, Jasmine knew that only careful preparation would allow her to break through the solid wall of the legal system that protected people like Judge Miles. The days that followed saw Jasmine immerse herself fully in the process of gathering evidence. She didn't allow herself to be swept up by fleeting bursts of anger. Instead, she dedicated every moment to analyzing, planning, and identifying the weaknesses in the system she could exploit. Each document, each recorded statement, each video clip was a crucial piece of the larger puzzle she was piecing together. She wasn't just focused on exposing Judge Miles. She wanted to unearth the truth about a legal system that had become increasingly corrupt, one that protected power rather than justice. Jasmine began reaching out to key witnesses, people who had been ignored by the court system. These were individuals who had been trampled by the system, oppressed without a voice to defend them. Jasmine knew she couldn't do this alone. Each story, each piece of evidence these individuals provided would be a powerful blow against the injustice they had endured. And with every piece she added, she came closer to her goal, bringing the truth into the light. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been oppressed by this system. She thought about the forgotten ones, the voiceless, the people who couldn't stand up for themselves because they lacked the power, the voice, or the means to fight back against those who held the power. Every day she fought wasn't just for justice for herself, but for all those who had lived in the shadows of injustice, for those who couldn't defend themselves because the system had already failed them. She didn't act impulsively. Every step she took was calculated. Jasmine always devised a strategy before facing any situation. She knew that this wasn't just a matter between her and Judge Miles, but a fight against the system itself. To defeat this system, she had to understand its weaknesses and exploit them intelligently. She knew that every move she made would be the first step in dismantling a structure that had existed for far too long. Therefore, every action she took had to be purposeful and strategic. The preparation wasn't just about collecting evidence. It was about crafting a sophisticated tactic. Jasmine meticulously reviewed all the records, previous cases that Judge Miles had presided over. She searched for contradictions in his rulings, cases where he had made errors or even acted corruptly. She found witnesses, court staff, and others who had witnessed the wrongdoings that the system had intentionally tried to hide. When Jasmine had gathered enough evidence, she began to strategize her next steps. She knew that she couldn't just launch a direct assault. She needed to create an element of surprise to pressure the opposition step by step. She had prepared an indictment that was irrefutable, a plan of action that would make everyone see her in a different light, with the respect she truly deserved. She would not rush into this battle. Every move she made would be calculated, deliberate, and powerful. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever been crushed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Jasmine Crockett would not just be heard. She would be respected, and the truth would come crashing through the walls of injustice. It felt as though a storm was slowly brewing within Jasmine. With each passing day, she saw more and more clearly that this case wasn't just a legal battle. It was a dirty game, one where shadowy forces were quietly manipulating everything behind the scenes. The details she uncovered left her in disbelief, unable to comprehend the extent of what she was witnessing. Jasmine sat in the courtroom, her eyes fixed on every movement of Judge Miles and the lawyers. Each time the judge slammed his gavel, Jasmine could feel the shift in the atmosphere, as though he were hiding something. She couldn't shake the feeling that every decision he made wasn't based on fairness, but on a plan that had been set long before the trial even began. Witnesses were systematically interrupted. Key evidence was deliberately ignored. Jasmine's attention turned to a crucial video she knew could clarify the case. A recording of police officers assaulting the victim. This video was supposed to be decisive evidence to prove the victim's innocence. But when it was presented in court, not only was it dismissed, it was shoved into a dark corner, ignored by everyone. The system had intentionally turned a blind eye to the truths that she and others were trying to bring to light. Jasmine knew that these pieces of the puzzle weren't mere coincidences. Someone within the system was deliberately trying to hide the truth. The covert exchanges between the lawyers and Judge Miles, the sudden decisions that were made without reasonable explanation, these details were slowly but surely confirming one thing. This case wasn't about justice. It was a battle to protect those who were manipulating it. The sense of injustice welled up inside her like a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Every time Judge Miles halted the trial to interrupt a witness's testimony, every time crucial evidence was dismissed, every time the witness's statements were cut short, Jasmine could feel the hostility coming from the system. It was hostility not just aimed at her, but at anyone seeking justice. These people, Those ignored witnesses, those silenced victims, were the ones she was fighting for. Jasmine could no longer stand idly by. She knew that if this continued under the current system's manipulation, the truth would remain buried forever. She couldn't allow this injustice to go on any longer. With an unshakable determination, Jasmine began to plan. She wouldn't just rely on the existing evidence. She would find a way to uncover new proof, ensuring that this system had no chance to hide the truth. The people in the courtroom might not see what was happening, but Jasmine knew she couldn't let them continue to manipulate this case. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been trampled by the system, a system that now Jasmine was determined to break. The tension in the courtroom seemed to rise to an all-time high. The Louisiana courthouse, once the place where Jasmine had been rejected and mocked, now became a battleground. Jasmine stood there amidst the skeptical gazes of those around her, clutching a stack of thick documents in her hands. She wasn't just bringing evidence. She was bringing the power to change the entire system. Each page in her hands was a piece of the larger picture she was assembling, a picture of corruption and the manipulation of power by Judge Miles. Jasmine had no intention of letting those behind these injustices escape responsibility. She knew that every piece of evidence she presented could completely alter the course of the case. The people in the courtroom, those who had once looked down on her, would now be forced to face the truth that she had meticulously gathered over the past weeks. Jasmine placed each file carefully on the table, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Every document she laid down wasn't just paper. They were pieces of evidence that could dismantle a system that had been in place for far too long. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Everyone in the courtroom understood that Judge Miles was not someone who could easily be brought down. But Jasmine was prepared for this confrontation. She knew what she was doing, and she knew this was the only chance she had to bring the truth to light. Judge Miles sat at his bench, his expression unchanged, attempting to maintain his calm composure. But deep down, a sense of unease began to creep in. Jasmine didn't need to speak right away. She simply flipped through the documents one by one, slowly, deliberately, as if she were exposing a dark secret they had all tried to keep buried for years. She began with an important audio recording, one in which Judge Miles could clearly be heard conversing with defense attorneys on the case. The words in the recording were unmistakable: collusion between the judge and those with power to manipulate the outcome of the trial. Every sentence, every word was irrefutable proof. Jasmine flipped to another set of documents showing illegal transactions Judge Miles had conducted with law firms to ensure the interests of certain individuals, ignoring both law and justice. These transactions, Jasmine said, her voice steady and resolute, are clear evidence of corruption. Judge Miles accepted money to manipulate this trial, and today I will prove that in this courtroom. Her words echoed through the room, and for a moment, no one dared move. The witnesses who had been silenced, the evidence that had been hidden, now it was all coming to light. Jasmine wasn't just presenting documents. She was wielding the power of truth to overpower the one who had hidden in the shadows, manipulating justice for his own gain. Jasmine's gaze remained locked on Judge Miles. She knew he was trying to hide the nervousness in his eyes. His fake composure couldn't conceal the fear creeping into him as the powerful evidence was laid bare. It seemed as though he was losing control, being sucked into the very game he had created. Jasmine didn't rush. She continued to turn the pages of the documents, each page another step toward confirming the undeniable strength of the truth. And then she presented the video, one that she had personally collected, showing Judge Miles ordering the reduction of witness testimonies, halting the presentation of crucial parts of the trial. This video was indisputable. It was proof that couldn't be erased. Judge Miles had deliberately manipulated the trial. Now no one could remain silent. Jasmine looked into the eyes of the people in the room, looked into the eyes of Judge Miles, and she knew she had dealt a fatal blow. She wasn't simply there to recount what had happened. She was there to create change, to tear down the filthy walls of corruption and injustice. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath after Jasmine presented the undeniable evidence of corruption and manipulation by Judge Miles. The atmosphere became suffocating and tense. Everyone present, witnesses, attorneys, and the prosecutors, felt the shift. They were no longer just watching a trial. They were witnessing a bloody battle between truth and power. Jasmine stood firm in the middle of the room. Every breath she took sliced through the silence that enveloped the courtroom. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the contempt, the skepticism, even the fear. Yet none of it could shake her resolve. She wasn't here simply to testify. She was here to shatter the web of lies that had surrounded this courtroom for far too long. As the tension reached its peak, when everyone began to sense that the truth was slowly coming to light, Jasmine stood up. She didn't need to raise her voice nor make a scene. She simply stood there, her eyes locked onto Judge Miles, and spoke in a calm, yet powerful tone. "Judge Miles, I demand an immediate change in how this trial is conducted. Your actions in this courtroom are not only a grave violation of the fundamental principles of justice, but also deliberate manipulation aimed at protecting those who have exploited this system for years." Each word she uttered landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room, shaking not just Judge Miles, but everyone in the courtroom. No one dared speak. All were captivated by the weight of Jasmine's words. It had been a long time since this system had faced such a determined and intelligent opponent. Judge Miles sat in silence, his hand gripping the gavel tightly. His usual air of confidence was replaced by visible tension. He looked at Jasmine, his cold eyes now betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Jasmine didn't flinch. She had prepared every piece of evidence, every tactic, and she knew this was the moment that would decide everything. She continued, "You cannot continue to wield this power to manipulate trials. What you've done during this case is not just a breach of the law. It's a betrayal of the very people you are supposed to protect." Jasmine moved closer, her gaze sharp as a knife, cutting through the silence that had overtaken the room. The people in the courtroom couldn't help but notice the determination in each step she took, the undeniable change she was bringing about. It felt as though the entire system was beginning to shake. She wasn't just a witness. She was the one standing up to challenge a system rotting from corruption and injustice. A moment that changed everything. Jasmine knew this was the time for her to do whatever it took to make the truth undeniable. She wasn't just demanding a change in this trial. She was calling for a deep transformation in the legal system that had long protected injustice. And in that moment, no one could turn a blind eye anymore. This was a moment of intense tension, where every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Jasmine. The atmosphere felt thick with anticipation. The faint sound of breathing became conspicuous in the stillness. Everyone present knew that what would happen next could change the course of this trial and possibly Judge Miles's career. Jasmine stood tall, her gaze never leaving Judge Miles, who sat in his chair desperately trying to maintain his usual cold, self-assured demeanor. But inside, he could feel the crumbling of the empire he had built over the years. He couldn't hide the anxiety rising in his every small gesture, his fingers tightly gripping the gavel. Yet he remained silent, unwilling to speak. Jasmine refused to let the silence linger any longer. She took a deep breath, regaining her calm and strength, and then began to speak, breaking the tension that had filled the room. "Judge Miles, I stand here today not just to testify, but to challenge the wrongful decisions you've made. You do not deserve to sit in this seat. You have abused your power to protect the rich and powerful, to ignore the truth, and to choke justice. You have betrayed fairness, and you have betrayed your own conscience." Each word from Jasmine felt like a powerful punch to Judge Miles's face. It wasn't just a simple condemnation. It was an accusation of his unjust actions. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom was now on her, and for the first time, Jasmine was no longer the one who was looked down upon or mocked. She had become the one fighting for justice, and everyone in the room had to confront the power of truth she brought with her. Judge Miles felt her words strike him like sharp daggers. Despite his attempt to maintain his cold composure, his eyes betrayed him, revealing his growing fear and confusion. Jasmine didn't stop there. "You think you can manipulate everything? Think you can hide the truth and trample over the poor, the powerless, those who are not like you? But today I stand here to prove that justice cannot be bought, and those like you will pay for it." She took a step closer to the judge's bench, each step heavy with resolve. It felt as if the entire courtroom was teetering under her presence. Every word she spoke cut through the truth that everyone had tried to avoid. She wasn't just challenging Judge Miles. She was challenging the system itself, a system she knew was protecting the corrupt. Jasmine didn't just expose Judge Miles's wrongdoings. She illuminated the unjust decisions he had made in the past, the cases he had manipulated, the wrongful verdicts he had signed. All of them came to light. Those in the courtroom could no longer ignore the truth Jasmine was laying before them, the truth they had tried to conceal for so long. Don't think you can continue sitting atop this throne forever. You're not just playing with justice. You're playing with the lives of innocent people. But today, justice will rise. This wasn't just a declaration of war against one judge. This was Jasmine's battle with a corrupt court system, with those who had exploited it for their own personal gain. And in this moment, she wasn't only challenging Judge Miles, she was challenging all those who stood on the side of injustice. She was ready to tear down the wall of power he had built for so long. The courtroom fell silent. Jasmine didn't need to say much. Every action she made felt like a punch in the face to all those who had once underestimated her. She stood there, her gaze sharp as a knife, with no trace of fear. Her words weren't judgments, but truths, truths that no one could continue to ignore. Jasmine began presenting the evidence she had meticulously gathered. Each document, each piece of evidence wasn't just meaningless paper. It was a powerful weapon exposing the corruption that Judge Miles and his accomplices had concealed for years. She placed each piece of evidence on the table before the court, not with a cursory glance, but with deliberate intent, each placement a declaration of war against the injustice that had been perpetuated. She began with the secret recordings, conversations between Judge Miles and the wealthy defendant's attorneys, the promises made, the illegal agreements. Everything was recorded, irrefutable. Jasmine carefully flipped through each page, each piece of evidence forcing Judge Miles into the unavoidable exposure. Every piece wasn't just an accusation, it was an undeniable indictment. When Jasmine placed the video on the screen, the entire room went still. It was a recording of the trial where Judge Miles had cut off the testimony of a key witness, silencing them, preventing the truth from being heard. Every second of the video was crystal clear, irrefutable, and once again, Jasmine had demonstrated the manipulation within the court that Judge Miles had orchestrated. Judge Miles sat there, his hand gripping the gavel tightly, his eyes unable to conceal his panic. Each piece of evidence was like a painful wound, making him feel the collapse of the power structure he had built over the years. He hadn't prepared for what was unfolding. He had believed he could easily control this trial, but now it was him who was being controlled. Judge Miles tried to maintain his composure, but the tension in his body was impossible to hide. He had begun to lose control. Jasmine's gaze remained unflinching. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to show her frustration. Everything had been proven with the sharp evidence she had so carefully prepared. A bead of sweat ran down Judge Miles's forehead, not from exhaustion, but from the rising fear within him. He could no longer deny what had been exposed. Everything he had once thought was untouchable was now being brought to the light. Jasmine stood tall, her eyes as sharp as ever. She looked directly at Judge Miles and said, "You can try to deny it, but these pieces of evidence won't disappear. Justice will never be hidden for long." The courtroom was silent, everyone holding their breath as they watched every move from Judge Miles. No one dared speak because everyone knew Jasmine had brought forth an irrefutable truth. She had brought the truth into the light with strength and authority, forcing everyone to face the wrongs they had tried to deny for so long. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Miles tried to maintain his calm, but in his eyes, everyone could see the confusion, the fear he could no longer hide. He knew that this time there was no escaping the truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating. Every breath seemed to echo in the tense silence as Jasmine stood there, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. All eyes were fixed on her, the woman who had not only endured the weight of injustice, but was now determined to shatter the very foundation of the system that had oppressed her and so many others. The words she had spoken earlier had blown apart any illusions of innocence surrounding Judge Miles, exposing the truth in a way that could no longer be ignored. The air was thick with a mixture of excitement and fear, emotions swirling in the quiet but heavy stillness. Jasmine stood tall, unwavering, her gaze locked onto Judge Miles, who had begun to show visible signs of panic. His normally confident demeanor was crumbling, his entire body trembling as his hand gripped the gavel. He couldn't hide the fear that now consumed him, a fear that wasn't just from the accusations Jasmine had made, but from the inescapable truth that his actions were finally being brought to light. He had built a powerful empire of manipulation and control, but now he could feel it all slipping away. Jasmine could feel the power in her hands as she stood before the court. The evidence she had gathered, the painstaking hours spent collecting the truth, wasn't just the story of one case. It was a force capable of dismantling the entire corrupt system that had allowed people like Judge Miles to flourish. This wasn't merely about winning a case or making a point. It was about justice. It was about exposing everything that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. Jasmine wasn't just a witness. She had become a force of nature, an unstoppable presence standing up against an establishment built on lies and deceit. She stared down at Judge Miles, her voice calm but brimming with power he could no longer deny. Judge Miles, you no longer hold any power over this court. You have abused your position, manipulated justice, and used your power to protect the corrupt and the powerful. Your actions have undermined the very foundation of our legal system, and today you will answer for what you've done. I demand the immediate arrest of Judge Thomas Miles for corruption, abuse of office, and the manipulation of justice. Jasmine's words didn't just ring out in the courtroom. They reverberated in the hearts of everyone present. They weren't just a statement. They were a demand, a bold, unwavering call for accountability. Jasmine wasn't simply standing up for herself, but for every person who had been crushed by a system that had allowed the powerful to run roughshod over the innocent. She wasn't just demanding justice for the past. She was demanding a future where such injustices could no longer thrive. The courtroom stood frozen in stunned silence. No one dared speak or move. The weight of Jasmine's words had hit like a thunderclap, and in that moment, the entire court seemed to hold its breath. Judge Miles sat motionless, his fingers tightening around the gavel, but his mind was in chaos. The mask of control he had worn for so long was slipping away, and now, for the first time, he had to confront the consequences of his actions. He could no longer deny what was happening. He could no longer hide behind his position or his power. Jasmine's words had torn down the walls of his empire, and he knew deep down that there was no escape. Every person in that room, from the attorneys to the witnesses, could sense that something monumental was happening. The weight of the moment was palpable. For the first time in this courtroom, they saw Jasmine for what she truly was, a warrior for truth, standing tall in the face of overwhelming odds. The judge who had once been untouchable was now being exposed for what he was, and all those who had turned a blind eye to his actions were forced to confront the reality they had ignored for so long. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice or make a scene. Her calm, composed presence was more powerful than any outburst could ever be. Her words carried the weight of the truth, and in that moment, the truth was unstoppable. Judge Miles, once an authoritative figure who had manipulated the system to serve his own interests, now found himself exposed, vulnerable, and powerless. Jasmine had shifted the entire dynamic of the courtroom with a single demand. A bead of sweat ran down the side of Judge Miles's face, not from the weight of physical exertion, but from the mounting fear. He had never expected this day to come, the day when his power and control would be completely stripped away. The man who had once sat above the law, who had used his position to silence the voices of the oppressed, was now the one silenced. Jasmine's words were the hammer striking the final blow, and Judge Miles knew that his time had come. Jasmine stood unwavering, her eyes locked on Judge Miles. She didn't need to say anything more. She had already said everything that needed to be said. The truth was out in the open, and no amount of manipulation or fear could put it back in the shadows. Jasmine had exposed the rot at the heart of the system, and now it was time for the rest of the world to see it too. Justice will no longer be hidden behind walls of power, she said, her voice firm. It will no longer be drowned by the whispers of those who think they are untouchable. Today, justice will stand tall. The courtroom was in shock. No one dared to move, speak, or object. Jasmine had done what no one thought was possible. She had forced the truth to the surface, and now it was undeniable. In that moment, everything changed. The system that had once protected the corrupt, that had allowed Judge Miles to operate with impunity, was now under attack, and Jasmine was leading the charge. Judge Miles remained seated, his eyes wide with fear, but he knew that he had lost. The moment Jasmine stood up, the moment she made her demand, everything shifted. She wasn't just demanding an arrest. She was demanding an end to the culture of corruption that had dominated the courtroom for so long. And Jasmine knew this. She had just taken the first step toward changing everything. She wasn't just exposing one corrupt judge. She was exposing a broken system, and now there was no turning back. The courtroom now felt like it was on the brink of a storm. Every movement from Judge Miles, no matter how small, seemed to add fuel to the fire that was rapidly consuming the room. He had lost the composure that once marked his authority. After Jasmine had demanded his immediate arrest, he began to fight back, even though it was clear that every action he took was only escalating the situation further, pushing things toward an irreversible point. Judge Miles growled in anger, his voice filled with frustration and tension. "You have no authority here. This is my courtroom, and you cannot do this." His words twisted with panic, but there was also a hint of aggression, as if he still held on to hope that he could salvage the situation. Yet his words only thickened the tension in the room, and Jasmine's gaze never wavered from him. Jasmine had no intention of backing down. Her eyes, as cold and sharp as ever, she stood straight, her arms crossed calmly in front of her, her demeanor composed and fearless. "Judge Miles, you can shout, you can try to intimidate me, but you cannot undo what has already happened. The evidence I've presented is irrefutable, and this system can no longer hide the truth." Judge Miles's resistance only served to escalate the tension further. He could no longer maintain the confident, authoritarian air he once had when sitting at the bench. His body shook, sweat beading on his forehead. The public accusations now forced him to face the truth he had spent years avoiding. The courtroom had transformed. No longer was it simply a place where cases were heard. It had become the battleground for something much bigger. The people in the room could no longer remain passive. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and even the witnesses could feel the change in the air. One by one, the witnesses began to speak out, no longer silent in the face of corruption. They stood up, one after another, supporting Jasmine, exposing the wrongs, and demanding that justice be served immediately. Quiet applause began to ripple through the room, small but powerful, like a silent yet determined wave of resistance. One by one, people began to stand, showing their support for Jasmine. The claps grew louder, signaling a clear protest against Judge Miles. These weren't just the witnesses on the stand. These were people who had witnessed firsthand the injustice Judge Miles had perpetuated. Voices that had once been silenced were now finding the courage to speak. This growing movement only deepened Judge Miles's fear. He realized that the situation was beyond his control. This wasn't just Jasmine's fight anymore. It had become the fight of everyone who had been oppressed by the corruption and injustice of the system. Everything had spiraled beyond his grasp. Jasmine remained unshaken. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering, resolute. "Let justice speak for itself. I'm not standing here just for myself. I'm standing here for all those who have been abandoned by this system." The people in the courtroom began to understand that this wasn't just another trial. This was a historical moment. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for her own justice. She was fighting for all those who had been cast aside by the system over the years. She wasn't merely battling for herself. She was battling to make the system change so that all those who had been overlooked, treated unjustly, and silenced could have their voices restored. All eyes in the courtroom were on Jasmine, and in that moment, she was no longer just a witness. She had become the symbol of change. A battle had begun, and no one could look away anymore. The courtroom had descended into an eerie stillness, yet beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Jasmine had created an earthquake, a powerful strike against the very foundation of the legal system, a system that had long been accustomed to manipulation and injustice. As the evidence she presented came to light, the shadows could no longer be hidden, and those within the system, from officials to lawyers, began to feel the creeping fear that Jasmine had unleashed. The cases that had been hidden for years were now being exposed one after another. The wrongful decisions, the covert transactions, and the illegal agreements between Judge Miles and powerful lawyers were all laid bare, without mercy. The evidence Jasmine had brought was not just mundane legal documents. They were the dark stains on the face of a system that had long harbored corruption and injustice. The light had pierced into every dark corner of this system, and now no one involved could continue to ignore the truth. The court officials, from the lower ranks to the higher echelons, those who had once been complicit in the wrongful verdicts, now felt an unease rising within them all. It took was one person daring to challenge them, and the empire they had built in the shadows would crumble like a sand castle in the face of a violent wave. The lawyers in the trial, those who had once relied on power to cloud the truth, now began to falter. Faces that had once exuded confidence and arrogance now showed signs of tension. Some began to look for ways to leave the courtroom, not wanting to be associated with the truths they had known, but deliberately kept silent about. A few whispered quietly to each other, exchanging fearful glances, as if sensing that just one more move from Jasmine could bring their carefully constructed world crashing down. The hidden relationships between the officials and the lawyers were now being exposed. Secret meetings, unofficial calls, and under-the-table deals were laid out in vivid detail, things the public had never known. Cases that had been manipulated to serve personal interests were now vivid proof of the deep-seated corruption within the system. Jasmine wasn't just fighting against Judge Miles. She was battling an entire empire of power, a legal system that had rotted from the inside. She could see the change unfolding before her eyes as people started standing up, not just for her, but for everything this system had destroyed. For those who had once believed in the fairness of the law, this scene was almost unbelievable. As the irrefutable evidence was laid out, and as the officials and lawyers could no longer deny what they had been complicit in, they began to realize that everything they had done for so long was part of a great deception. Jasmine's resistance was no longer just a personal confrontation. It had become a powerful wave exposing the crimes that the entire legal system had worked to keep hidden. The fear among those in the courtroom was becoming more palpable. They realized that things could never go back to the way they were. The dramas they had once performed, the unjust verdicts they had upheld, were now stripped bare. The very people who had manipulated and controlled the system from the shadows were now the ones facing the truth that Jasmine had brought to the surface. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the shift. They realized that no one within this system, whether judge, lawyer, or official, could escape the justice that was now being served. The voices of the witnesses, the growing applause from the public, became louder with each passing moment, supporting Jasmine in her fight. She was no longer the only one standing up. Now all those who had been oppressed by corruption were standing with her, and no one could silence them anymore. The momentum was undeniable. The truth had been exposed, and Jasmine's battle was no longer hers alone. It was the battle of everyone who had been silenced, forgotten, and denied justice by the very system that was supposed to protect them. And with each person who rose in support, the walls of corruption began to crack, one piece at a time. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal proceedings. It had become a battlefield for truth, where the people had finally found their voices. Justice had finally triumphed, and Jasmine stood firm at the center of change. Her victory was not just for herself, but for all the victims who had been abandoned by this unjust legal system for so many years. Those who had been trampled by wrongful decisions, those who had never had a chance to speak up, could now breathe a sigh of relief. She had become the light that guided them out of the darkness, the torch that gave hope to the oppressed. As Jasmine stood before the public, those who had once been disregarded by the court system began to step forward, slowly but with unyielding strength. They walked toward her, their eyes filled with gratitude, a profound thankfulness that Jasmine had risen to speak on their behalf. The mothers, fathers, and children whose families had been torn apart by wrongful convictions could now see a glimmer of light shining in their lives. The sight was almost unbelievable. These victims of injustice were now standing alongside Jasmine, someone who had done what no one else dared to do, someone who had given them hope for a fair world. Jasmine was no longer just a victor. She had become a symbol of liberation for those who no longer had the strength to fight. "Thank you, Jasmine. You've given us hope," said one woman, her eyes filled with tears but her voice strong. The entire courtroom fell silent, witnessing the change in a society that had pushed these people into oblivion for so long. Jasmine smiled faintly, needing no response. She understood that gratitude wasn't something she sought to receive. It was what fueled her to keep fighting, to continue pushing for justice. Court officials and those who had once been exploited by the system began to realize that change could no longer be postponed. Jasmine's actions had not just been a personal struggle. They had sparked a historical movement, a revolution that would reshape the entire system. Court officials who had once viewed themselves as wielders of power now began to question, can we continue to turn a blind eye to the truth? Discussions began to emerge within the legal system. Each individual within it slowly realized that it was time for change. The existence of corruption within the system could no longer continue. Jasmine had not just changed one case. She was creating a powerful wave of reform within the court itself. A wave of reform began to take shape. Meetings and improvements in how the courts operated started to unfold, all stemming from the historic moment that Jasmine had ignited. Officials and lawyers within the court could no longer remain indifferent. They began to listen. They began to face their responsibilities. The wrongful decisions made in the past could no longer be swept under the rug, and they realized that the ultimate goal had to be a fair legal system. The courtroom was no longer a place where power was manipulated. Jasmine had opened the door to change, and now officials, lawyers, and everyone within the system had to ask themselves if they could continue with the old ways. Everything had changed, and there was no longer room for injustice. Jasmine's story became a phenomenon, the subject of hot discussion across all media. The arrest of Judge Miles in the courtroom was not just a victory for Jasmine, but a historic event, a testament to the triumph of justice. Media outlets and the public couldn't take their eyes off this story. Articles, TV programs, and social media discussions began to flood with information about Jasmine, about her struggle. The people who had been forgotten before, victims of the legal system, could now speak up, could now find faith in justice again. Jasmine's story became an endless source of inspiration for all those who had been trampled by injustice, and now they knew that no one had to endure silence any longer. Jasmine had become the embodiment of justice. She was not just a resilient woman, but someone who had transformed the system, bringing people from the shadows into the light. She was a source of strength, a model for those who long for fairness in society. The former victims now found a new fire in their hearts. They were no longer the defeated, no longer invisible in the society. They could see the change, the rebirth of justice, and the renewed faith in a system they now knew they could trust. This moment was not just the conclusion of a legal battle, but the final confrontation with those who had wronged Jasmine's mother for years. Jasmine knew that she could only complete her journey when she exposed all the crimes that had been carried out in the shadows, when the ruthless, powerful figures who had used their positions to harm her mother were held accountable. Judge Miles was not the only person Jasmine had to face. She turned back to the past, where those who caused the injustice to her family now had to answer for their actions. The officials, the individuals within the system who had stood by in silence, allowing her mother to endure unbearable suffering, now had to face the consequences. Jasmine was not only fighting for herself. She was determined to seek justice for her mother, who had been crushed by indifference and injustice. Jasmine walked back into the courtroom, but this time she was not just a witness. She was the one who would change everything. She faced the people who had harmed her mother, no longer with fear or uncertainty. She spoke powerfully, demanding that they be held accountable for their wrong decisions, for the suffering her mother had endured. Each word from Jasmine was like a slap to the face of those who had caused the harm. She was not only fighting for one case, but fighting to restore justice for all the victims who had been trampled upon by those in power. Her mother was no longer alive to witness this moment, but Jasmine knew that she had to do this, not just for her mother, but for everyone who had been oppressed by the very system of the courts. With victory in hand, Jasmine didn't just change the court system. She continued her journey to inspire the younger generation. Returning to the law school where she had once been rejected because of her appearance and ethnicity, Jasmine was no longer just a graduate. She had become a symbol of hope, a source of inspiration for the students facing great challenges in their lives. Standing before a hall full of young students, those who were still hesitant about the system, Jasmine shared her story, not just about fighting in the courtroom, but about the lifelong battle she had endured. She emphasized that justice was not just a personal story, but a collective mission for society. She encouraged the new generation to never give up, to never let the system of oppression silence them, reminding them that they have the power to change the world. Jasmine's words resonated strongly. We don't just stand up for ourselves, but for all those who have no voice. Justice is the right of every individual, and it only truly exists when we all stand up for it. She didn't just change her own generation. She helped the future generation understand that they could change the world, that justice would no longer be an elusive concept if they were ready to fight for it. Jasmine stood before the public once again, but this time she wasn't just the victor of a case. She was the initiator of a revolution. She ended her story by asserting that her journey was not just a personal victory, but the first step toward a comprehensive transformation of the legal system. This was only the beginning. Jasmine looked ahead, where the silence of victims no longer existed, where those in power could no longer manipulate and trample on others without fear. Each step she took now represented not just her personal transformation, but the rebirth of a legal system that had long been abandoned. She knew that her struggle could not end here. The oppressed would no longer remain silent. They would stand up, and they would reclaim their voices. Justice would always find its way. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for a victory in one case, but she had opened the path for others to find hope, for the belief in a fair and fearless legal system to take root.